Good afternoon. It's a beautiful Friday before it gets cold again, unfortunately, on May 7th today as we get ready to head into the weekend again. And I'm getting to spend a little time with you. I've been starting to try to work on this pile of wood that's been outside of the parsonage here in the driveway area, starting to split and move and trying to get that to work. And when I split wood, I have two tools I use. I use a maul and a sledgehammer, and try to make that work. And the thing is that as I've been working on this today, I keep reflecting in spiritual thought, realizing that what I've been doing today is an awful lot about what it means in our life of Christian faith as God's working with us. The fact is that again, our nature is so completely bound up in being human that we don't even realize it. Our sinful nature, the scriptures reminds us constantly that we are an enemy of God's, and that's something that we really need not to forget. I have to be reminded of that fact, because if I hold that in check and think, well, I'm taken care of because of Christ and the cross completely, then I miss everything Martin Luther has talked about and the thing he offers us through the understanding of the fact that we're simul justus et peccator. At the same time, we are a saint and a sinner. And everything changes around these very simple things that either we fall off on the side of wanting law and beating ourselves and beating others in the law, or we fall off on the far other side, which is that grace has happened and grace has abounded, and we are a completed and done work, despite the fact that Paul talks about that he who has begun a good work in you will bring it to completion. We forget that I am still a work in process. I'm always a work in process. And sometimes I'm more attentive to that work, and sometimes I am very much not attentive to that work. And it is the truth for everyone who exists. The real challenge, as I sat and thought about this today, is all this pile of wood sits on the end of the house, and there's gutters that pour over, and because they're a little bit cracked on the ends, they drip. And splitting wood should really be a simple thing if the wood is good and dry. You find the piece and you hit it with a maul and it'll split pretty well, of course, if you hit it in the right spot, and not miss like so often in my aging self I do. But those pieces of wood have been sitting there, and in the last several days again have been soaked. The water has poured off of them, and this isn't a baptismal image I'm using here. This is an image of how the world soaks us with something that makes us unworkable for God. The truth is that dry wood, thirsty wood, is easier to split because it now doesn't have this artificial thing holding it together anymore, even though it's dead. I mean, the wood has been cut off of a tree for, I don't know, a year, maybe, in some cases, up to a year. And yet it's been getting soaked with this other thing that continues to make it seem like it's not thirsty, it's not brittle, it's not splittable. And so if I understand the image of myself as that piece of wood living in the world, and if I get soaked in all the things of the world that try to convince me through Satan's lies and the challenges which he brings to me to understand God fully, or I assume that somehow I've become understanding in such a depth that I really don't need to be reminded or hear, then God really can't work with me, despite his great desire and love to do that. He wants so much to work with us, because the truth is he's trying to split us. He's trying to split you and I from the sin within us, and to separate that sin from us. And God has two tools. I have two tools. I have a maul and I have a sledgehammer. And the maul, which is a heavy, supposed to be sharpened kind of axe-ish end and a sledgehammer end, usually is what I can split the wood with no trouble. when the wood is dry and I hit it, it splits and it breaks off. But sometimes in using that maul, it gets stuck in the piece of wood. And then I have to get out my sledgehammer because the maul is now buried deep in the piece of wood, and it's fighting to let go. It's fighting to let that maul out. And so I have to keep hitting it with the hammer, the sledgehammer. Now, I know what you might be thinking possibly here and how this works, but you see, the gift of God is described in the book of Hebrews in the 4th chapter as a two-edged sword that literally is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword, that penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit and joints and marrow. It judges thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight, and everything is uncovered and laid bare. You see, God's trying to separate us from this condition, and he has already, in a sense, because of the crucifixion and resurrection, done so. But yet every day he's working to have us not forget what he's done for us, to remember, to live in his way despite our very quick fall back into being soaked up in the world's stuff that holds us where it wants to. And so when I hit it with that sledge, it usually will take a couple of shots sometimes to drive it through to split the wood. Now, God uses this double-edged sword, and he has a sledgehammer too. There's an author named Bo Geertz, a Lutheran author, who wrote a book called The Hammer of God, and you might be thinking that that sledgehammer is moral law, but the truth is the sledgehammer is grace. The hammer of God that breaks everything finally through is the hammer of God in God's grace. And that's the rest that God's calling us to. He's calling us into this rest after he separates us so that we can live in the freedom of the Christian, as Martin Luther talks about, to serve our neighbor. We're freed from being soaked in the world and being so just full that we can't even be worked with God, even though we think we are. And even though we think we're letting him. And the truth is, I'd have to say, if I were that piece of wood, it hurts to get hit. The law does hurt. It does remind us that we are in a challenging place. And that wood just doesn't want to split. Neither do you or I. And so God works through the gifts of the church and preaching and teaching and the scriptures and law and gospel work. He calls us to come every Sunday to allow him to work to split us from the world and to hear the grace that he's pouring out on us over and over, to touch it, to feel it, to taste it in communion. And yet, even though it's the rest that he's offering us, we still become very disobedient. We become people who don't think we need that. We become people who misunderstand that. We become people who let the law and the lies try to make us not understand what God's doing out of love for us and a desire to call us to himself forever. And it really can be challenging. When I have to keep hitting that wood over and over and over again, it wears me out. Luckily, God doesn't get worn out. But the fact is that just like that two-edged sword is meant to split us, to open us up, to reveal the truth of our condition so that God can cut it away from us and fill us and restore us with his grace, so that maul and that sledgehammer do the same. When we get hit like that piece of wood, sometimes that maul gets stuck and we get caught up in the law. We either become people who get angry with it and we begin to start dishing it out on other people. We keep trying to find ways to do things that everybody else ought to, and we hold everybody else accountable instead of realizing what God's doing with me. And we need to be hit by the sledgehammer of grace as well that allows us to let go so that he can open us up and make us what he needs us to be usable fuel for his kingdom, to bring the word to others around us. But when it gets stuck, that hammer has to hit us. The law such an easy way, which demonstrates exactly why we're human. It has such an easy way to get caught in us, and we let it get caught, especially if we're soaked in the world. And we miss the fact that what God's doing is trying to say, no. I'm trying to pull apart this thing that is opening or tearing you apart so I can open you and I can fill you now. I can give you rest. Hebrews 4 is a wonderful chapter that talks about this rest, and it's not just a Sabbath rest, a Sunday rest, but it's God's rest eternally, and the thing He's longing for us to enter into. And it, interestingly enough, talks about today as being the day that Jesus said, and the day that Jesus talked about, today. Because today is the day that God's trying to reach you and me. Today is the day He's trying to break through in our life. But if we don't expose ourselves to the maul and the sledgehammer that God lovingly gives us on both ends, how will we ever really be His? How will we ever really receive what He's offering us? The invitation to come to worship is God's gift for us. He doesn't want us to despise preaching in the Word, because He's offering us again another day to come and sit in His presence and remember who He is. As we're studying the small catechism with the Tuesday study, we look at the beginning of the commandments start with Exodus 20 and God's clear declaration of law and grace. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of bondage and slavery in Egypt. So therefore, live this way. I'm the God, He says, who's done this for you. I'm the God who's brought you from these things. And so now living this way in the law keeps this constant work of splitting and cracking and moving this stuff away from us so that He can have us be more and more full of Him and His kingdom, and to be usable in His kingdom to help others come as well. But that is our call. That is our vocation. It's to bring others to Christ, to declare the great works of the Lord, to understand the gifts of God so that we can invite others to come and receive what we have learned is a gracious gift of love, not hardship. And yet, Hebrews 4 talks about that as well. Because you see, when we get hit with that sledgehammer, so often we think God doesn't care. Or we think that someone is picking on us, that God's word is trying to point a bony finger at us and say, you are not worthy. That's not the case. At the end of Hebrews 4, it reminds us that we can approach the throne of grace because we have a high priest, Jesus, who understands completely our condition. So much so that He gave His life for us so that we would be His and be able to be His, and therefore be workable for Him. But when we miss that point, when we think somehow that we're being picked on or being heavily dumped on by God's law, which convicts us, you see, then we walk away from it. We turn our backs on God's work that He's trying to do for us. The fact is, I have to hit the wood to split it, otherwise it won't work in a fireplace. The fact is that I have to realize that I need both the maul and the sledgehammer, just like God wants to use them on me. I need to make myself available as the wood does to be split. But ultimately, it has a fiery purpose to light us up, to let us bring the light of Christ to others who are in bondage as well. God uses two very simple tools. He uses the law and the gospel, and He does so because His desire is for you and I to come and to be cleansed of all the things that keep us, knowingly or unknowingly, from Him. Depending on the piece of wood, it can be easy to split. When wood has become dry and realizes, in a sense, that it has nothing left holding it together, when that maul hits it, it just splits nice and clean and simple, almost, you would say, effortlessly or painlessly. But when it's soaked in the world, when it's still too green, when it's still caught up in the idea that it's not dead, even though it's been cut into a length and cut off of a tree, then God's work is so much harder for us. Really, what happens when we come to worship is we're called to remember that the truth is really we are in bondage. We are unable to free ourselves. And only Christ, only Jesus Christ can free us from that. But to do so, he has to use his tools and remind us of the truth of our condition so that we hold and cling eternally to him, seeking to live a life more and more like him, to bear his light in the world. I hope you have a blessed weekend. I hope that you find yourself to be able to worship and spend time with the God who wants to open you up again and then to pour himself in you for strength, for healing, for encouragement, and the reminder that he has already claimed you and loved you forever. God's blessings. Have a great weekend.